Hello and welcome to 5 Frames From. Today I'm talking about the documentary film Stories We Tell, a documentary by Sarah Polley and released in 2012. Now this documentary is all about Sarah's family and her relationship, particularly with her mother Diane, who died in 1990. It's about Sarah investigating her mother's life and also the sort of hidden secrets, and spoiler alert, she discovers that her father is not who she thought it was. This documentary took 5 years to make, so that will give you a sense of how personal the story is to the filmmaker, but also how much involvement the filmmaker had and how much manipulation potentially she may have done. Even though it's about families, it's also about documentary making. And I think it's really interesting from that point of view. We need to think about what Sarah includes in the documentary and what she removes and why she does that. The documentary starts with a quote from Alias Grace, a well-known novel by Margaret Atwood, and the quote says, "When you're in a story, it isn't a story at all, only a confusion." I think that sets up straight away Sarah Polley's approach to storytelling, that actually there are lots of different versions of it. You never get two people saying the same thing, and it becomes a big jumble and a mess of different voices. And I think that's why Polley lets lots of people contribute to her documentary. She is largely voiceless herself. She tends to stay quite quiet. There's a few moments where we see emails from her, but largely she is just exploring this idea of storytelling and the way that we need narratives to make sense of life. So I think the family thing is actually probably quite secondary to all of the stuff about documentary making and storytelling and filmmaking. One of the most interesting things about the documentary is the way that Sarah combines Bill Nichols' different documentary modes. So I've said the film is about the making of documentary, so it's definitely a reflexive documentary. It definitely thinks about how the audience interacts with the information present, and we're definitely encouraged to think about how these stories are told, how they're put across. Polley uses loads of reconstructions, and I'll talk about those later. She uses quite a poetic voiceover. She also reads out emails. So the way that the story is told is definitely something that we think about, and so therefore she definitely makes use of the reflexive mode. She also exhibits the participatory mode because she is on screen and she's interacting with the subjects, particularly the moments where she is talking to who she discovers is her real father, Harry. So there's just two of the modes, but you could argue that more of the modes are included as well. So have a think about how she plays around with these different things. We also might consider the approaches of John Grierson and D.A. Pennebaker. We could argue that this is much more about the creative treatment of actuality, and we're being presented with things in a very creative way, in a very manipulated way. However, there are moments where it feels a bit more observational, so we see a bit of Pennebaker's influence as well, particularly in some of the scenes where she's kind of setting up for filming, and we'll explore that a little bit later on. Now, if you are a student studying the EDUCAS film study specification, you'll be more interested in the ideas of filmmakers such as Peter Watkins, Nick Broomfield, Kim Longinotto and Michael Moore. Now, you only need to know 2 of those, so don't worry if there are names there that you haven't heard. We could argue that Sarah Polley's approach is a little more like Peter Watkins because she relies on reconstructions, and within those reconstructions she uses actors, and they're particularly well cast to look like Diane and to look like Harry and to look like Michael. So definitely have a bit more of a think about Peter Watkins. With Nick Broomfield and Michael Moore, we could say that there's some similarities in terms of that participatory mode. But we could also argue that both Broomfield and Moore have these sort of on-screen personas which allow them to get the most out of their interviewees, and often they're kind of trying to get confessions out of interviewees, and there's much more of a sort of investigative, expository approach in their documentaries. So quite different to Sarah Polley, but we can see some connections. And then we've got Kim Longinotto, who perhaps is the least like Sarah Polley. Longinotto says that she doesn't want the audience thinking about her after they've watched her films. She wants them thinking about the subject matter. And of course, with Stories We Tell, we are thinking about Sarah Polley and what's happened to her and the family as they go forward. We could argue that there's some similarities in that Stories We Tell is a little open-ended. There is that kind of twist ending as well. And we could maybe make some connections in terms of feminist subject matter. So, for example, Diane's life, the people that judge her, for example, and the fact that she sometimes experiences very little power in her own life. So all of those filmmakers are worth considering in connection to this documentary, and that just gives you a little taster of some of the things we might think about. So finally we're on to some frames, and here's frame one that I've chosen from very early on in the film. And before this, we've seen an overhead shot of Michael and Sarah sort of walking up the stairs. We've seen them sort of entering the building, things like that. So we're getting a sense of the scene being set and a sense that this is pure observation. But actually, if we look more closely at the shots, we can see that they've been very carefully set up. And direct cinema in the observational mode tends to rely a bit more on handheld camera. So stylistically, it's a little bit different. But it does feel like we're observing naturally what's happening on this day of recording. Again, before this shot, Michael comments on how much he's got to read, and we find out that this is a story or a script that he's written. And again, this is quite unusual because documentaries tend to avoid scripts, or at least avoid acknowledging that there is a script. There might be a script in there in the voiceover sometimes. The voiceover that Michael provides is quite poetic. The story is interesting and the way that he refers to the characters is interesting, so it's worth kind of having a listen to that in a bit more detail. This shot though is a long shot and a wide shot, and it allows us to see in the foreground all the mise-en-scène of the recording booth, and it gives us a sense that this is a technical moment. This is a product that's being created. For all their connection and family ties, actually we're being taken into a world where something technical is happening. So already we're starting to think about the documentary and the way that it's made. She talks about this documentary as being an interrogation, which I think is interesting. It kind of sets her up as a bit of a detective, but a detective of her own life story. And throughout the documentary, her family often ask her what she's trying to achieve through the filmmaking, and she often avoids answering that question. So I've mentioned in the foreground that we have got all the technical stuff and the recording stuff. It looks very professional. These are people that obviously are aware of how the film world works, and there are connections with kind of acting and filmmaking. Sarah, we can see in the very background, she's a bit difficult to picture, but we can see her kind of standing behind Michael, and so perhaps this is an indication of her presence throughout the film. She is in the background, it's her story, she sort of looms over the entire narrative, even though she asks people to tell the story in their own words. I think the inclusion of the window looking through is really interesting and perhaps gives us a sense of voyeurism. Maybe it reminds us that what we're watching is someone else's life. We are the observers. We are about to observe what's going on. So there's a lot going on in terms of audience positioning and creating the story and thinking about the documentary form. So the next frame I've chosen is this one of Diane Polley. And this is used quite early on in the film, but it's also used elsewhere, and later on there's a little bit of diegetic sound which goes with it later on, which sort of explains what she's doing there. But here early on in the film, this is played with a non-diegetic song, which is Skinny Love, performed by Bon Iver. And this gives this moment a particularly poignant feel because the song is quite slow, it's emotive. It talks about love not necessarily lasting, but hoping that it does. And so this gives us some sort of perspective on Diane's life. And there is a sense that we're being manipulated as the audience right from the very start. But the reason I've chosen this frame is not because it appears lots, and there is lots of repetition in this film. You'll notice that there's hardly any actual sort of archive footage, that a lot of it is reconstruction. But that archive footage is repeated an awful lot throughout to give the documentary more authenticity. But the reason I've chosen it is because this is a moment where Diane is very still and very natural. She's seen in this mid-shot, waiting to be given her cue, and she's smiling, she looks happy, as I say, very natural. And this contrasts with everything else that's being said about her at this time, about her vibrancy and her joy and her love to laugh. Here she is, very still, very quiet, and this is one of the very few times that we see her like this. I think the suggestion here is that we're seeing the real Diane. Diane at work, but the real Diane. And one of the other things that reinforces this is the fact that it's black and white, which gives it a sense of nostalgia and this idea that it's a reflection of the real past. And also there is a bit more in the soundtrack, another non-diegetic sound, which is that of sort of film whirring through a camera. So again, that gives it that sense of the past, and this being the official past. Another thing that gives it this authenticity and the fact that we know this is real footage is that there is a hair trapped in the camera, so we get this strange mark across the frame. Going back to this idea of black and white, it's interesting that Polley puts most of the reconstructions in colour, and she uses a Super 8 camera to do this. So I'm just putting up on the screen one of the examples of reconstruction, and we can see actually the similarities between the actress and Diane Polley and that deliberate decision to try and make those reconstructions as real as possible. Now, Polley says that she didn't intentionally set out to confuse anyone, but she was interested in the way that people tell stories, and she did want the audience to reflect on, you know, what they'd seen and whether it was real or whether it was reconstructed. So the use of those reconstructions adds another level to the documentary and again creates this reflexive mode. She says that only about 40% of the film is genuine Super 8 camera footage that her dad took, and that the Super 8 camera must have broken when she was 3 or 4. So, well, with that in mind, we can see again a lot of repetition, but again a lot of reconstruction that is very, very cleverly done and made to seem very realistic. The actress who plays Diane Polley, Rebecca Jenkins, apparently knew Diane in real life and did a lot of research for the role, but had been seen many years before by Sarah Polley's brother John, who was a casting director and thought when he saw her she would be the perfect person if we were ever to create a story about Diane's life. Whenever we see Diane in the reconstructions, she's always very vibrantly dressed, you know, bright colours. She's often moving around, so dashing through the snow, falling over, things like that. And going back to this original frame that I chose, really contrasts with this moment of stillness and of authenticity. So my next frame is of Sarah's brother John, who is the casting director that I mentioned. And the reason I've just chosen this frame is because he represents Sarah Polley's siblings and her family. And we see quite early on a montage of the family members. It's cut together quite quickly. And they're all kind of just getting ready again for the interview. So we see Sarah behind a camera. There are things like boom mics left in the shot and so on. And all of these things create that authenticity. One of the sisters says, I think you can see me sweating through my shirt. Another one says that she needs pills. So we get a sense that what we're going to see is their vulnerability and honesty on screen. There's also a sense that they don't really understand what Sarah's doing or why she's doing it. And maybe that represents the audience a little bit when we're thinking about Sarah's motivation for creating the documentary. It's through these moments and interviews with friends and with Harry that we get this idea of Sarah wanting lots of contributions to the story. And she says to each person, you know, tell the whole story from beginning to end in your own words. One of the reasons I've chosen John is because he's an older brother and he worked with Diane Polley. So perhaps some of his recollections are a bit more reliable, perhaps. He is the one that kind of talks about the pregnancy and Sarah's father. He also asks Sarah questions, so he interacts with her. He's very much got a sense of the person who is off screen. And through his questions, we hear Sarah's voice. So he's quite important in the storytelling, I think. One thing about him being the casting director is he's given some credit for making the whole film gel together and for those constructions fitting so neatly with the genuine Super 8 footage. He says, "It was surreal having to audition myself at age 18. I've been casting for about 25 years and never have I had to release a breakdown describing what I was like as a teenager. I made sure I got someone who was way better looking than me too, because I like the idea of rewriting history." And that comment, "I like the idea of rewriting history," also summarises what the documentary is about, and also goes against everything that we think of as documentary. Documentaries being things that observe the past or look towards the future, but do that in what appears to be an objective way. But of course, this is a clear admission of subjectivity and casting someone in your favour. One decision that I find very strange that Sarah Polley has made is to put these things that we know are kind of meant to be modern day into this Super 8 footage so that it looks really retro and grainy. We can see this example here of Sarah and her real dad Harry leaving the restaurant where they meet. And this is an unusual decision, I think, and it really shows that creative treatment of actuality. She really is playing with the footage and the way that she films it. We can only speculate as to why Sarah Polley does this. Perhaps it's to make sure that the documentary flows. Perhaps it's to make the footage seamlessly blend together. Perhaps, and possibly more likely, it's to point out that this documentary is a construction and it is subject to her decision making. Perhaps also it's about making sure that people realise that the construction footage is construction. She says she doesn't make it obvious straight away, but she expects people to realise, throughout the film. So maybe by putting the more modern footage in the same style, maybe it makes it more obvious. I think in this two shot, we start to see the relationship between Harry and Sarah. There's a lot of discussion at this point about how happy he was to find her. I think Harry is a really interesting character because what he adds to the story is a completely different take. He's there talking about how Diane was the love of his life, how he wanted her to go and live with him, how, she lit up the room and he was very selfish in terms of just wanting to be with her all the time. And this kind of contrasts with what other people are saying about her. Other people are sort of saying that Michael was the person that she adored and wanted to be with. So he's an interesting character. He also is the one that doesn't really like the idea of there being multiple voices in the story. He wants it to just be himself. And it's interesting to think about why he wants that and why Sarah doesn't want that. Which nicely leads me on to my final frame of Jeff, the man that Sarah Polley originally thinks is her dad. And here he is being interviewed in a sort of talking head style interview, which is very typical of documentaries. He appears fairly early on in the film and is discounted as the father. He denies it, but she says she thinks there's more to his story. And then as audience members, we kind of forget all about him. What Sarah Polley does is put in this extra little bit of information from Jeff at the very end of the film. So this is what she's leaving us with. And Jeff basically says, no, he's not the dad, but he should probably tell her that they did sleep together. So this creates some humour, but it also creates questions in the mind of the audience. Is anything that we have just seen true? Harry's described this great love affair between him and Diane, but actually then we get this information that Diane slept with someone else as well. The fact that Sarah decides to leave it to the end to reveal this information as well perhaps makes the audience question the structure of the documentary and the ways in which Sarah is manipulating what we find out and when. So it is a light-hearted, in some ways, end to the documentary, but at the same time it leaves us with all sorts of questions, and perhaps that's what I mean by the documentary sort of being a bit open-ended, in that we do think about what was true in what we've just seen and what have we been manipulated into believing. It's a great end to the documentary. So that's where I'm going to finish for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you again for another 5 frames from. Bye bye.